And now to Quantico, Virginia, where the president delivered an address to top U.S. military brass that placed new emphasis on the role of the armed forces inside the country. The sudden gathering, called at short notice, drew admirals and generals from around the world and fueled speculation even before the president stepped on stage. However, after President Trump took over, the message was clear. The U.S. military should prepare for what he described as an enemy within. He argued that America faces domestic unrest and crime that should be treated with the seriousness of a foreign war. In fact, he even proposed using American cities, particularly those under Democratic leadership, as training grounds for federal forces.
We have many cities in great shape, too, by the way. I want you to know that. But it seems that the ones that are run by the radical left Democrats, what they've done to San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, they're very unsafe places, and we're going to straighten them out one by one.
All right, people, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. Nearly 800 senior military commanders, generals, admirals, and enlisted leaders from posts worldwide were ordered to report immediately to Quantico on impossibly short notice. The unprecedented mass summons sparked wild speculation about mass firings, war announcements, or a national emergency. Then the doors close. The Secretary of Defense warms up the room by complaining about fat generals. His exact words. He imposes new fitness standards, bans beards, declares the department has gone woke and lost its way. And then the President of the United States walks out and tells the assembled leadership of the American military who the real enemy is. And folks, it's you. It's Americans. He tells them, America is under invasion from within. He says, we're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. And then this, and I want you to really hear it, at least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out.
And this is going to be a major part for some of the people in this room. That's a war, too. It's a war from within.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also spoke, declaring an end to woke culture inside the Pentagon, and announced that combat roles will now require gender-neutral or male-level standards for physical fitness. His comments set the stage for President Trump's broader focus on reshaping military culture and priorities.
Frankly, it's tiring to look out at combat formations, or really any formation, and see fat troops. Likewise, it's completely unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the halls of the Pentagon and leading commands around the country and the world. It's a bad look. It is bad, and it's not who we are. So whether you're an airborne ranger or a chairborne ranger, a brand new private or a four-star general, you need to meet the height and weight standards and pass your PT test.
And the president's speech wasn't confined to just domestic issues. He also highlighted his involvement in Middle East diplomacy, claiming that a ceasefire in Gaza could be reached as soon.
Take them out. The President of the United States speaking to the entire senior leadership of the armed forces, describing his domestic critics as an enemy force and lamenting that they're harder to eliminate because they don't wear uniforms. Think about what happened in that room. He told 800 of the most decorated warriors alive that the enemy is inside the country, that it won't get out of control once they're involved. And he floated using dangerous Democrat-run cities, his framing, as training grounds for our military. Training grounds, American cities. Are you kidding me? And here's the detail that gives me actual chills. The room's response was nothing. Trump went on for more than 70 minutes, a full rally-style performance with boasting, insults, and applause lines. And by every account, the generals sat stone-faced. They didn't laugh when prompted. They didn't clap on cue. 800 of the most powerful military leaders on the planet, and the room gave him absolute silence. Now, that silence was professionalism. Active duty officers don't cheer or boo presidents. That's the rule, and thank God for it.
Under his plan, which he said has been accepted by Israel and Arab states, but still requires agreement from Hamas.
But we have just about everybody. We have one signature that we need, and that signature will pay in hell if they don't sign. I hope they sign for their own good and we create something really great.
And bizarrely, the president once again raised the issue of the Nobel Peace Prize, insisting that his record makes him deserving, but lamenting that recognition is unlikely. He described the lack of acknowledgement as an insult to the United States.
Will you get the Nobel Prize? Absolutely not. They'll give it to some guy that didn't do a damn thing. They'll give it to a guy that wrote a book about the mind of Donald Trump and what it took to solve the wars. And he'll get the Nobel Prize will go to a writer.
And speaking about Ukraine, President Trump expressed disappointment in Russian President Vladimir Putin, criticizing the length of the war and suggesting Russia should have concluded the conflict quickly. He maintained that U.S. diplomacy under his leadership could still bring the fighting to an end, though no breakthrough has yet to be achieved.
Disappointed in President Putin. I thought he would get this thing over with. He should have had that war done in a week.
But everyone who watched understood what that wall of blank faces meant. And apparently, so did a lot of the people who used to sit in those chairs. Because in the months since, the retired brass, the ones who are finally free to speak, have been sounding alarms in ways this country has genuinely never seen. Before we go further, let me put the oath on the table, because everything tonight hangs on 12 words most Americans have never actually read. Every officer in that room at Quantico raised their right hand at some point and swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The Constitution, not the president. The president isn't in the oath.
And I said to him, you don't look good. You're 4 years fighting a war that should have taken a week. Are you a paper tiger? And it's a shame, but I think eventually we'll get that one done.
And of course, the president could not conclude his speech without attacking his predecessor, Joe Biden, blaming the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan for emboldening Russia. He contrasted Biden's presidency with his own, portraying himself as a leader who restored global respect back to the United States.
We're witnessing the triumphant return of peace through strength. We have great peace through strength. America is respected again as a country. We were not respected with Biden. They looked at him falling downstairs every day. Every day the guy's falling downstairs. He said, it's not our president. We can't have it. I'm very careful.
President Trump ended with emphasizing his vision for the U.S. military's future, a force focused less on political correctness and more on toughness, readiness, and domestic security. He even applauded efforts to rebrand the Pentagon as a Department of War, calling it a reaffirmation of America's purpose and pride. The president's overarching message was stark. The military's most important battles may no longer be foreign, but actually domestic.
And now hold that oath up next to what Trump told them, that the enemy is domestic, is within, doesn't wear a uniform. Do you see the trap being set? He's borrowing the sacred language of their oath, enemies, domestic, and quietly swapping in his own enemies list. Protesters, democratic cities, critics. The oath was written to protect the Constitution from tyrants. He's trying to reframe it at the tyrant's opponents. That's the con at the center of this entire story. And the generals, both serving and retired, saw it immediately because they, unlike most of us, know the oath by heart. This brings us to a truly unprecedented moment in American history. The pushback isn't coming from random pundits or cable news talking heads. It's coming from the very men Trump used to parade around as my generals. James Mattis, his own first Secretary of Defense, a Marine Corps legend, publicly declared that Trump is the first president in his lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try, and warned that using troops against protesters attacks the very idea that we're all equal under the law. John Kelly, Trump's own chief of staff, a retired four-star Marine general who lost a son in combat, has described him as a danger to the Constitution. Mark Milley, the man Trump made chairman of the Joint Chiefs, same warning. Add William McRaven, the admiral who ran the Bin Laden raid. Joseph Dunford, John Allen. Commanders of that caliber publicly rebuking a sitting president is, as one analysis put it flatly, unprecedented. These aren't resistance bloggers, folks. These are the men he hired. And how does Trump answer that caliber? Exactly how you'd guess. Not with arguments, with insults. When Kelly spoke out, Trump's operation called him a total clown and diagnosed him with a debilitating case of Trump derangement syndrome, dismissing his first-hand accounts as fabricated, debunked stories. He once branded Mattis the world's most overrated general. And Mattis, in one of the great comebacks in modern politics, noted that Trump had also called Meryl Streep an overrated actress and deadpanned, so I guess I'm the Meryl Streep of generals. Funny, genuinely funny. But step back and look at what's actually happening. The pattern is always the same. Attack the messenger, never the message. Judges, prosecutors, Fox hosts, and now four-star generals. Nobody's warning is ever addressed. Everybody's character is assassinated. Now let's talk about why this even matters. Because civilian control of the military sounds like a textbook phrase until you understand what it's protecting you from. The American deal, going back to George Washington himself, has two halves. The military obeys elected civilians. No coups, no juntas, no generals seizing power. And in exchange, the military stays out of politics. It serves the Constitution, not a party, not a person. Officers swear their oath to the Constitution, not to the president. That's not a technicality. That's the whole design. It's why America, almost alone among great powers in history, has never had its army turn on its own people or its own government. Every piece of this story, the Quantico speech, the letters, the outrage, is a fight over whether that deal survives. So when you hear generals and norms in the same sentence, don't glaze over. The norm is the thing standing between you and soldiers in your street answering to one man's mood. Back to Quantico. The details deserve daylight. The warm-up act was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who told the assembled brass that the department, freshly renamed the Department of War by the way, had become the woke department and lost its way. He announced that it's unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the Pentagon, imposed twice-yearly PT tests and height-weight standards on everyone, including the flag officers in the room, banned beards, and said he'd ordered a review of what counts as toxic leadership because, in his view, the term had been weaponized. Then Trump took the stage and delivered the enemy within material we covered, plus a history lesson in which America went woke when it renamed the War Department, a change made for the record by Harry Truman in 1947, a man nobody has ever accused of wokeness. 70-plus minutes. 2 commanders pulled off duty stations around the globe for that. And the domestic deployment talk wasn't abstract. That's the part that turned this from cringe into crisis. Trump has mused about cities like Chicago as training grounds. He reportedly suggested that troops facing protesters throwing bricks could get out of their vehicles. In his words, do whatever the hell you want to do. Sit with that phrase for a second. Whatever the hell you want. That is the precise opposite of everything the American military teaches about rules of engagement, proportionality, and discipline. Doctrines written in blood over 2 centuries specifically, so that armed forces never freelance violence, least of all against their own citizens. Civil military experts heard that line and went pale because whatever the hell you want, spoken by a commander-in-chief about American protesters, isn't tough talk. It's an invitation to atrocity with a permission slip attached. Now the pushback. And let's be precise with the numbers, because precision is what separates us from the meme slingers. This didn't start at Quantico. Back in 2020, after federal forces were used to clear peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square for a photo op, the dam broke for the first time. More than 780 retired senior officers and national security leaders, including 22 retired 4-star generals and admirals and 5 former secretaries of defense, signed an open letter warning about Trump, writing simply, "We love our country. Unfortunately, we also fear for it." Signatories described agonizing over it because retired brass wading into politics violates their deepest training. One retired general explained he never so much as donated $1 to a campaign before signing. In 2022, 8 former defense secretaries, including Trump's own Mattis and Mark Esper, signed another letter reminding the country that officers swear an oath to the Constitution, not fealty to an individual. And since the enemy within era began, the interviews, columns, and warnings from retired flag officers have kept coming in waves, hundreds of voices across multiple rounds spanning 6 years. That's not a news cycle, folks. That's an institution screaming. It's worth pausing on why Lafayette Square was the original red line, because it explains everything that came after. June 2020, protesters in the park across from the White House, peaceful ones by the official reviews that followed, got forcibly cleared so the president could walk across the street and hold up a Bible for cameras. And crucially, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, walked in that entourage in his combat fatigues. He later apologized publicly in uniform in a commencement address, calling it a mistake that created the perception of the military involved in domestic politics. Think about that. The nation's top officer felt he had to apologize to the country for being in a photo. That's how seriously the institution takes the line between soldiers and politics. That's the culture. And that's the culture that then got summoned to Quantico years later to hear that American cities should be training grounds. The men in that room remembered the apology. The man at the podium clearly did not. But now, the fairness pass. And this one's genuinely important because it complicates the story in a way you need to hear. Retired brass have mobilized for Trump too. In 2021, 124 retired generals and admirals signed a letter pushing the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. In 2024, more than 200 retired flag officers signed an endorsement of Trump, blasting the previous administration's border and social policies. So the honest picture is not generals versus Trump. It's a retired officer corps splitting into political camps. Letters for him, letters against him, stars on both sides. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every one of those letters, whichever direction it points, chips at the same foundation. Because the public doesn't carefully distinguish retired from active duty. When citizens see generals as political combatants, trust in the military as a neutral institution erodes, and that trust is the last broadly shared trust America has left. The critics would say Trump forced their hand. Silence in the face of enemy within talk is complicity. Maybe so, but nobody should pretend this politicization is cost-free, no matter whose side the stars land on. And the fight has already turned openly vicious. Which brings us to a post you might remember from our previous coverage. A group of Democratic lawmakers, all veterans and former intelligence officers, released a video reminding service members of something that is black-letter military law. Troops must refuse illegal orders. That's not a controversial statement. It's taught in basic training. It's the principle that came out of Nuremberg. In Trump's response, he posted that their message was seditious behavior punishable by death in all caps. The President of the United States publicly musing about the death penalty for elected veterans who recited standing military doctrine. That post was so extreme, it became the basis for actual impeachment articles filed in the House. And it answered better than any critic could the question at the heart of this whole story. What does this president believe soldiers owe him? Because the correct answer is nothing. They owe the Constitution everything and him nothing beyond lawful orders. And the all-caps rage at anyone who says so tells you he knows it and hates it. Behind the public letters, there's a quieter, sadder layer. Reporting has described former Trump administration officials, military and cabinet, privately debating whether to speak out, held back by two fears. Fear of politicizing the uniform further, which is honorable, and fear of retribution from Trump and from his supporters, which is chilling. Think about what that second fear means. People who commanded armies, who faced enemy fire, hesitating to exercise free speech in America because of what one man's movement might do to them and their families. Whatever you call that climate, you cannot call it healthy. The generals who did speak knew the cost. Kelly, belittled. Mattis, dismissed as overrated. Milley, smeared and spoke anyway. The ones still silent are telling you something too, just in a language of held breath. Now let's break down what all of this actually means. The enemy within doctrine is the whole ballgame. And it's not a gaffe, it's a worldview repeated on purpose. Foreign enemies justify armies. Domestic enemies justify what exactly? Once a president trains the military's focus inward onto cities, protesters, critics, the enemies that don't wear uniforms, every constitutional firewall starts to smoke. This is why the retired brass broke 2 centuries of silence. Not over tax policy, not over tariffs, over the specific singular red line that separates every democracy from every coup. Armies do not point inward. Mattis drew that line publicly in 2020 after Lafayette Square. Quantico proved the line isn't being respected. It's being scouted. Training grounds, whatever the hell you want, it won't get out of control once you're involved. Those aren't slips of the tongue, folks. That's a doctrine being read aloud slowly to the people who have to execute it. The My General's arc is the most damning character evidence in American politics. Forget the partisans on both sides for a second and just follow one thread. Trump personally selected Mattis, Kelly, and Milley. He praised them extravagantly. He put them at the absolute center of American power. These are men whose entire lives were built on duty, hierarchy, and loyalty to the chain of command. The least likely whistleblowers on planet Earth. And one by one, after working beside him at the closest possible range, each concluded he was a danger to the Constitution and said so in public at real personal cost. There is no partisan explanation for that pattern. Political enemies attacking a president is noise. The president's own hand-picked warrior class unanimously after direct observation. That's data. And his only rebuttal, 6 years running, has been Meryl Streep, insults, and derangement diagnosis. Attack the messenger. Never ever answer the message. The silence of the serving is the tell to watch. Those 800 stone faces at Quantico were doing the only thing active duty officers lawfully can. Nothing. And that nothing was deafening. But understand the bind they're now in, because it's the real stakes of this whole story. Every officer in that room has sworn to obey lawful orders and to refuse unlawful ones. For 2 centuries, that distinction was mostly academic. Presidents didn't issue orders that tested it. Now they sit under a commander-in-chief who muses about training grounds in American cities and death penalties for people who mention the words illegal orders. If the order ever comes, troops on protesters, whatever the hell you want, each of those officers faces a choice the letter writers keep warning about. Obey and break the oath. Refuse and break the chain. There is no third door. The entire purpose of the alarms you've heard tonight is to make sure that moment never arrives. Because if it arrives, we've already lost something no election gets back. So why does this matter to you in plain words? Because the military is the one American institution that still belongs to everybody. Red states and blue states fill its ranks. Its funerals are attended across every divide. Polls have shown it holding public trust long after courts, Congress, media, and everything else cratered. That shared trust is a load-bearing wall for the whole country. The enemy within Project stresses it from above, demanding the institution pick a side. The dueling retired generals' letters stress it from the sides, painting stars in party colors. And every American who cheers when the military is aimed at people they dislike stresses it from below. You do not want to live in a country where that wall finishes cracking. Nobody does. Ask anyone who's fled one. Who benefits from all this? In the short run, Trump. The strongman imagery thrills the base. The generals against me framing feeds the persecution narrative. And every day spent debating troops and cities is a day not spent on approval numbers, prices, fragile ceasefires. The engagement machine benefits. Enemy within clips both ways. Outrage and applause. The algorithm doesn't care which. Who loses? The 800 in that room ordered into a political rally and forbidden to react. The retired officers spending reputations built over 40 years to send up a flare. Service members and families watching their institution get dragged into the mud from every direction. And the citizens of whatever city gets designated a training ground first if the flares go unheeded. Which brings us to what you should actually watch. Watch 3 things. First, watch for orders, not speeches. The system's real stress test is the day rhetoric becomes a written directive, and the tell will be resignations. Senior officers don't hold press conferences. They quietly retire in clusters. A sudden wave of unexplained 4-star retirements is the fire alarm. Second, watch the punishment patterns. Whether officers seen as insufficiently loyal get purged, whether the toxic leadership review becomes a loyalty filter, whether anyone who echoes the illegal orders reminder ends up prosecuted. Third, watch the recruiting in the ranks, because the surest sign the politicization is metastasizing will be when Americans start asking whose army it is. And folks, the day that question has 2 different answers depending on who you ask, that's the day the American experiment is genuinely on the table. So here's your takeaway. Tied up tight. A president summoned 800 commanders from around the world to tell them the enemy is inside the country, doesn't wear a uniform, and would be easier to take out if it did. His own handpicked generals, the men he called mine, have spent 6 years warning you in unprecedented public rebukes exactly what they saw up close. His answer has been insults, derangement diagnosis, and in all caps musing about death penalties for veterans who cited military law. The retired brass is split, the serving brass is silent, and the one institution everybody still trusted is being pulled onto the field. The generals did their part. They sounded the alarm at the cost of everything they built. Whether anybody hears it, that part was never their job. That part is yours. The place all of this collides is the same place everything has been pointing. The midterms that decide the House, the investigations, maybe a third impeachment, all of it. This story isn't over. It's just beginning. And when the next chapter unfolds, you can bet we'll be here breaking it down.